If you guys are used to me filming, if you're used to my setup, I just wanted to point out that there are these weird sticky things on the wall because this thing fell down. So if you feel like something is missing, so entertain the fuck out of me. Oh my god! Hey there, my name's Portia Lori. Welcome back to my YouTube channel. Halloween was fun, wasn't it? I think it's kind of funny that the video that I'm doing back after all of my Halloween stuff is still kind of like Halloween adjacent, if you will. Today's video is all about the show You, and if you've ever watched the show You know that it's quite murder-centric. So I feel like this is the best way to kick off my holiday season videos by talking about murders. That's fun, right? As always, if you enjoy my opinion on all things pop culture, movies, music, TV shows, what have you, do me a solid and drop a like on this video, then run over to that subscribe button, hit the bell next to it, so you'll be notified every time I upload. So today, I'm going to really delve into what happened in season 3 and maybe some predictions that I have for season 4. Something that I think was a lot different about this season. In previous seasons, it always felt like they were leaving a few key notes of information out so that you as the audience would continue to guess as to what's going to happen next. Where's Joe gonna go from here? Did this person end up surviving or not surviving? This season felt a little bit more cut and dry. It felt a little bit more like, here's the problem, here's the result of what we did about said problem. I don't think that that's necessarily a bad thing. I feel like with the way season 3 ended, it wrapped up a lot of storylines, but at the same time, it did give us quite a few plot holes that we'll have to, wait until next season to really fill in those gaps. So without further ado, I'm going to get into reviewing season 3. Spoiler alert, I am for sure gonna ruin anything, so if you haven't watched season 3, I highly suggest you watch it with your own eyeballs, make your own assessments about it, and then come back to the video if you're curious about my opinion. Let's talk a little bit about season 2. Joe had moved to LA given that he found out Candace was still alive and he needed to escape her, at least until he could come up with a plan for how to take care of her this time around. Kind of become a real Angelino, if you will, even though he was so opposed to it. And meeting the possible soulmate or love of his life in the character Love. Now, at the end of season 2, we left off with Love's twin brother 40 passing away in kind of like this crazy happenstance situation at an Aversion. We find out that Love is pregnant. From the end of season 2, we know we're gonna be moving these characters into a completely different part of their life, becoming new parents. And that's where we start season 3. Joe and Love Quinn Goldberg are in Northern California to begin anew with their infant Henry after the explosive death of Delilah, Candace, and Love's beloved but damaged twin brother 40. As we catch up with the serial killer duo, we quickly learn that parenthood and marriage has taken quite a toll on the lovebirds, and it's starting to show. So, let's get into the main plots of season 3. Henry 40 Quinn Goldberg. I also want to make a quick note. The fact that they ended up getting married off camera, went to a courthouse, did the whole low-key marriage thing while she was pregnant, which was a little disappointing. I would have liked to have seen an on-camera wedding, but that's just because I'm a wedding addict and I just like to watch them. But the fact that they hyphenated their last names, I think moving into season 3 already shows you the level of control that Love has over Joe. And that's not to say that I'm painting Love as the villain. All I'm saying is that she obviously is very prideful of her family, very prideful of her name, but she's also hyper controlling, because I can't imagine a world where Joe willingly wanted to hyphen his name with hers. To go alongside that, they named their son Henry 40 Quinn Goldberg. And I thought that that was extremely important, and they definitely talk about it a lot, especially in the first episode. And it paints a very clear picture that Love has not dealt with the death of her twin brother, not fully, as well as Dottie, who almost exclusively refers to Henry as 40 for the entirety of the season. But we see that even Love calls Henry 40, and Joe a couple times catches himself calling his son 40, so this is like an ongoing issue. So main plot point, Henry, keeping him alive. That's pretty much the mission. And I would say that the majority of decisions that Joe makes in this season do actually coordinate a lot with him wanting to raise Henry to be less damaged than himself, which I thought was an interesting version of events. In previous seasons, to show Joe's kind of more sympathetic side, they have always given him some kind of like child counterpart that in some way, shape, or form reminds him of his own childhood. And in this season, that character is Henry, his own son, which was actually a really nice vacation from these random kids that would just be in the plot for whatever reason. Another main plot point for this season is Joe's aversion to love. That shows in the way that he interacts with love, even though they are still like sort of intimate and sweet to each other. I think they even share the I wolf views in the first episode. You can tell that his heart's not really in it. It's kind of just a facade. He's not really fully enveloped in the moment or with love or with Henry. And then to kind of look from the other side of that, for Love's point of view, her main plot through this season has been making the adjustment into becoming a new mom. She speaks about it quite a bit in this season, but you can tell that Love is really dealing with probably some postpartum depression, as well as just trying to find out who she is now. I've never had any personal experience with that. So I guess take everything I'm saying as far as like Love's journey of becoming a new parent with a grain of salt, because it's coming from someone who's never done either of those things. Not only is she a new parent and also newly married and wanting to be, you know, the best of both of those things, the best parent, the best wife, she also lives in a new city in a completely different kind of vibe. Northern California and Southern California could not be more opposite, to be honest. Now that is something I can speak to as someone who lived in the Bay Area. I think that her move to Madre Linda was a bigger culture shock than she probably thought it would be. She also is feeling, you know, she's not feeling great in her body. You know, her body has gone through this huge change. She senses the shift in relationship between her and Joe. It's not quite like it was in the previous season. And she's, you know, she's kind of lost her sexy. She's trying to still feel desired. And that's when we enter the character Theo. But I'm gonna get into both of their storylines a little bit later. I think the other big plot for season 3 was the disappearance of Matthew Engler, Joe and Love's neighbor, which again, let's get into that once I start breaking down these characters. So I'm gonna start with the new characters that are introduced in this season and kind of follow some of their journey, then the final, like the showdown, the final character arcs for Love and Joe, and then after that I will get into some of my predictions or questions I have about this season. But let's start talking about the new characters that were introduced with season 3. So something I really enjoy about the show You in general is I think the writing is really well done. Somehow they managed to create different personalities and different characters that don't feel too reminiscent of characters from the previous season every single season, as well as the casting. I think the casting for everyone on this show is done so well. For some of these actors that I've never seen before in anything else, it's going to be hard for me to separate their character from this show into something else that they're doing, but I think that's only a testament to how good their acting is. They were able to sell me so much on this character that I've truly decided to believe that this is who they are. I think that's a testament to good character creation. So I just want to do a little golf clap, if you will, for everyone who's on this show. So the first new characters I have to talk about are the ones that annoyed me the most because they were just so good at being terrible humans. Sherry and Carrie Conrad. Oh no, I already hate them. Their names rhyme. Get a divorce. They are the poster children for monetized family units, okay? Sherry runs a mommy blog where she talks about what it's like to have twins and all of the trials and tribulations of being a family. You know the archetype of this character, so I don't think I need to tell you it. Whether you're a parent yourself or you just follow some of these mommy bloggers, but the actress that plays Sherry just emulates this character so well. I loved to hate her all season. They were very integral in moving certain plot points forward. For Sherry, she is the reason that Love and Marianne ever met. Sherry had hired caterers, but they fell through, and so she ended up having to have Love come in and fill in. When they're throwing the charity event at the library, that's when, albeit briefly, where she's able to make some connections that go further in the plot later on. Also, Sherry throws that party, which is like, I believe in the first episode, where it's just like all the parents hanging out. That's where Love meets Natalie. The Conrads basically serve as like a conduit for other scenarios to happen. It's also why they get locked in the cage, is because they try this whole swinger lifestyle that shows Love that Joe is cheating on her, like from connections made through that night, and they end up having to put them in the cage later because they overhear that Love killed Natalie. Even though they are conduits to create other situations or move other things forward, I think that they have some really standout performances and moments in the show that they're not just like the people that are like, oh, set up so that, you know, the main characters can go do this. They also have their own motivation, which makes sense to their characters. And Sherry obviously wants everyone in town to like her, to love her, and so she puts on a front to kind of introduce Love into their clique, but more so to just like pull information out of her, not because she actually gives a shit about who Love is or her personality or anything. I think it's just to keep up this facade of being like this ultra mega super great neighbor. And then on the opposite, we see that Carrie is kind of like this man's man kind of guy, and he basically takes all of the dads in town, all of the guys on this like annual camping trip, and that's where they are able to like let go, be their like man selves so they can't be around their wives. And that is the conduit for Joe being able to then pursue things with the whole Marianne thing later on. But then they have these moments when they're locked in the cage where they really break down, and they know that they only have each other, and it's kind of like this beautiful full circle moment where you see them let down their facade and just be themselves, and you find out that even though their relationship seems pretty fictitious, like I was thinking, it was like they're for sure together because of the clout and the money, and you know, they're already tied to each other so intricately in social media, that's why they're there together. And we get these like beautiful moments of them together in the cage, bonding again, refinding each other through this shared traumatic experience, and it's kind of beautiful. And I remember that at the end when she finally finds the key, I was like, they're actually gonna survive. And I'm happy about it. Kudos to them. Again, golf claps all around. Our next new character is Dante, and even though he doesn't have a huge role or really like his own storyline going on throughout the season, I did want to make a mention of him, especially since him and his husband Lansing end up having custody of Henry by the end of the season. But Dante is Joe's blind co-worker that works at the library. He's also very close with Marianne, and he doesn't really have too big of a role this season. The most important thing that's really notable about his character is that him and his husband have been trying to adopt for quite some time, but they are having a lot of issues because they are a gay couple. Dante helps Marianne prepare for her own custody battle. I just thought it was important to bring up Dante. I really enjoyed his character. I thought his personality was super funny, and I appreciated that him and his husband ended up having Henry at the end of it. Our next new character for this season is Marianne, and she is by far my favorite character this season. From the moment she was introduced, the first thing that came out of my mouth is, please don't kill her. For the love of God, that's the only thing I thought all season, and I was very surprised and happy to see that she made it through. Marianne plays the manager of the library where Joe ends up working and becomes Joe's new infatuation. They kind of gain this bond over, again, shared trauma. They both came from really broken homes. We don't know as much about her childhood background, but what we understand is that she did move around to several different foster homes, as well as what it's like to be an addict. She was an addict with her ex-husband, and she is now on the mend from that. She goes to meetings and she's trying to put her life back together so that she can regain custody of her daughter, Juliet. We find out relatively quickly that Marianne's ex-husband is a news reporter for like the local news station. I want to say it's like Channel 6, and his name's Ryan Goodwin, and he is a white, seemingly well-liked news reporter in town, and he's also an addict. And while they were addicts together, she got into a very intense car accident with her daughter in the car, and thus her custody was then taken away from her. He seemingly got clean, whereas it took her a little bit more time to get there. And as a result, he has basically hung this over her head, as he has full custody of their daughter and she only really has visitation rights. She's been fighting to gain more and more custody of her daughter, but she's always being put down by Ryan. It's very clear that she's very afraid of him, and I don't think it's just because of all the connections he has. I think it's also from a physical point of view. And of course, this is Joe's Achilles heel, something we've seen even more this season. He definitely has a very weak or soft spot for women who are being battered by their significant others. Lastly, before I move on from Marianne, I just have to point out that I never talk about this because the show's like so serious and it's about like murder. So like I'm really focusing on that aspect of it. But I just have to say, whoever did the costume design this season, dude, everyone looks glamorous. Every outfit looks fantastic, and I want Marianne's entire wardrobe. Also, specifically the Alice in Wonderland themed library charity event. Everyone looks absolutely magnificent. I never talk about costume design, like literally in any of my videos. I almost never talk about how much I like the clothing, but I loved the fashion this season. Let's move on to our next new character. So then we have Ryan Goodwin, whom I don't really have much to add about his character. I don't like this guy for obvious reasons. He is an emotionally abusive man. He is an addict as well. And unlike people perceive him to be, he goes to all these like NA meetings and all of these things, and he stands up for being like, I don't do drugs anymore, but I used to. But what we actually find out is that he's still doing them. He's just doing them in a more underground way. And Ryan is Marianne's ex, so he is the reporter, and we're introduced to him I think in just episode 1. Like, he's reporting about something and he's a total dick once he's off camera. So I knew from the jump, like, they never pretend to give him like a heart or anything. They never play him out to be this some kind of like slightly sympathetic character. No, he's just a tool through and through. Our next new characters are Matthew and Natalie Engler, central characters for this season, seeing as how the disappearance of Natalie takes over at least the first half of season 3. But Matthew Engler is someone that we see throughout the entirety of season 3. Natalie is the attractive neighbor that lives next door. We kind of saw glimpses of that character, or what would be that character, at the end of season 2. When we catch up with Joe at the beginning of season 3, he's been stalking Natalie for quite some time. It's kind of the only thing he gets to do outside of taking care of a newborn. And it seems as though Natalie may have the same kind of interest in Joe. She notices him watching her several times, and she does kind of like point it out as like, I see you watching me. If anything, it kind of seems to turn her on more. She's not off put by it, which I always find to be peculiar, because like I notice when people are watching me, and I've never found it sexy or a turn on. So I always find it really weird when these women are being watched, they know they're being watched, and then they approach the person watching them as if it's like, no big deal. Those are things that I always find to be like, that's just because this is a TV show and they need to make the TV show run. But maybe, I don't know, maybe other people feel like that. They romanticize the idea of what it means to be watched by someone, like they're so in love with you, versus they're infatuated or have, I don't know, murderous thoughts going through their mind when they're watching you. But anyway, Natalie definitely entertains the idea of Joe watching her and ultimately invites him to come over to her house where they share a glass of wine and kind of talk about what it's like to be married. She's clearly very unhappy in her marriage, not realizing how controlled she would be once she, you know, said I do. And that's become kind of a point of contention between her and Matthew. Joe kind of feels a similar way with Love. He didn't realize like he would feel so tied down or that he would constantly be under her thumb. But the moment that they kind of start to escalate things to the next level, I think Natalie ends up kissing Joe. He immediately is like, I don't want to be this person anymore. I told myself I would be better for my child, and he extracts himself from the situation, which I also thought showed some sort of growth on Joe's side of things. He tells Love like what happens to some degree, leaving out the obvious kiss that was involved with their interaction. Love kind of tests Natalie later on at that party that happens at Sherry Conrad's, and because Natalie is not 100% honest about Joe being in her house, she basically concludes from that conversation that this is Joe's new infatuation and Love needs to get rid of said infatuation. So Love murders Natalie in cold blood. So with Natalie dead, they obviously have to create some kind of ruse to like throw off the trail so no one finds out what really happens to Natalie. Enter Matthew, who is Natalie's husband, and of course like he's very surprised by what's happened. He doesn't think that this is how his wife would behave. It feels fictitious to him, and so he starts looking further into her disappearance, especially after the body is later found and it's concluded that one of their other fellow neighbors, Gil, was at fault for murdering her. That just doesn't sit well with him. He's able to get a hold of all of these surveillance videos from around town, and he's ultimately looking for what really happened to his wife. I appreciate this storyline, and I think it's relatively reasonable to think that this would happen. My only problem with this storyline is that I feel like there are very few scenes with Matthew delving into how he feels about his wife. And sometimes Matthew came across to me as a little like fake. I don't know. There's just something about the character that I didn't totally win me over. Like something about him, I wasn't sure exactly why I don't know. It didn't seem like there was a whole lot of love that he had for Natalie. Maybe just because he came across incredibly stoic. Like he's supposed to be this tech guy, so my understanding is like he's not great with emotions. He might just not be good at interacting with people on like a regular level. Like maybe he's just not good at small talk and stuff like that. But he just came across to me so aggressive. I didn't feel for him as much as I maybe would have wanted to. So Matthew Engler also has a son who plays quite a prominent role in this season, and that character's name is Theo. When Love is starting to put together a bakery, the one that she ends up buying from Natalie. I forgot to mention this in the previous little blurb. Natalie is a real estate agent. Love mentions that she is a trained chef and that she hasn't been able to really do much in that department since the birth of Henry. So Natalie says, hey, you know, I have this space that I think could work perfectly for you. How does Joe put it? She purchases the crime scene. Later on, when we see Love shopping for supplies for her new bakery, we are introduced to Theo, college-aged kid I think he's wearing a Stanford hoodie. He walks up to Love as she's packing her car and offers his help. When we first see this character Theo, we're kind of introduced to him and they're having this like quick banter. I didn't really think much of it. I thought that maybe she would just get hit on and that was like the thing they would talk about in therapy, but like it wasn't gonna be a reoccurring thing. But then later on, when we find out that Theo is actually Matthew's son and the next door neighbor, I was like, oh no. Theo reminds Love quite a bit of 40, which is both incredibly gross to think about too deeply, but also makes a lot of sense because she hasn't dealt with the death of her brother. He's trying so hard and he's so infatuated with Love. I just wanted him to find a girl of his own age. And like the fact that he made it through this season impressive. I thought for sure, I was like, that kid's gonna die. Either Joe's gonna kill him or Love's gonna kill him. Incredibly surprised to see that he actually survived. And how he survived actually took me by surprise quite a bit. Lastly, to round out the new characters, I know I might have skipped over some other smaller characters, but to me, if they didn't play a huge role into the outcome or the main plot points, I just decided to drop them. But finally, we have Nurse Fiona, who is the featured character in the flashback montages that we get for this season. In this season, we're seeing a slightly older Joe, a Joe that has now been separated from his mom and living in some kind of like boys' school. I think they show him going there at the end of season 2. And he's getting bullied quite a bit due to the fact that he believes that his mom is going to come up and swoop him up and save him one day. And all the other boys knowing that that most likely is not ever gonna happen. And so they ridicule him for it. So Nurse Fiona is the school nurse, and she recognizes that Joe is being bullied, and so she kind of offers her office and, you know, her emotions to kind of coddle and help him out and help him kind of escape. I think it serves to show as the foundation as to why Joe is the way he is. Nurse Fiona both reminds him of his own mom. There's a few times where her significant other comes to the school and they have interactions, and Joe's able to kind of eavesdrop on that, and he sees that she is also being abused. Once he makes that clear to Nurse Fiona pushes him away, probably because she feels super embarrassed, and it's also a really hard topic to talk about with, you know, this kid. Later on, we find out that, you know, eventually Nurse Fiona doesn't come back to the school ever, and they're cleaning out her office, and it's basically understood that her significant other murdered her. There were a few flashbacks where Joe had moments where he thought about taking care of the situation, much like he did with his own biological mom. I don't love the flashbacks, I'll be totally honest, but for this season, I actually really enjoyed this storyline with Nurse Fiona. This more showed me why he would go to such an extreme like murder to ensure these women's safety. I also realized that there's one more new character I didn't put on my list, but I do want to shout out to the therapist that Love and Joe end up seeing. I wish I had put her on the list, but I do love the dichotomy of them trying to go to therapy to deal with the murder of Natalie, but obviously not being able to talk about it, you know, layman's terms. So they're dancing around it and finding different ways to explain what the real problem is. And I like that. We saw Joe doing that in season 1 with Dr. Nikki, right? And so I thought it was like a nice callback to kind of see that kind of transition again. So now that we've talked about all of our fresh and new characters, let's talk about the returning ones, which there's not that many from this season. I think given the fact that every season they have moved to a different location also allows them to introduce all of these new characters and drop so many, which always keeps the season pretty fresh because you don't really know what to expect of these new characters yet. I always compare this show to this, but Dexter, I think everyone compares you to Dexter because it shares just so many similarities in just the format of it. But with Dexter, by, you know, the time you get to like season 5 or 6, I felt like as an audience member of being like, how is he going to continue to get away with all the same people around him all the time? By having him constantly moving to a different place after everything transpires, which makes more sense because I think if you were going to be a serial killer, you would have to keep moving to different locations. So the first returning character I want to talk about before I get into the real depth of it, which is Joe and Love's storylines, let's talk about Dottie. I did like the addition of her character. Even though she is in season 2, we don't see her popping up a whole lot. And so to see her relationship with Love played out for the audience more, I could understand why Love had such an aversion to her mother and everything her mother represents. Her mom definitely blamed her a lot for the death of 40, and you can still see that kind of happening in this season, that she still holds that over her head, as well as the fact that she continuously calls Henry 40 all the time and is, you know, quite certain that Love's child is the reincarnation of 40, and so therefore she also feels some kind of possessiveness over their child, which is extremely harmful, not only Henry, but for Love as well, and for Joe, who seems to just always has a slight distaste for Dottie. in general, but he doesn't really voice it, except for later on in the season when she ends up having her big breakdown. There were a couple moments that I really enjoyed her character this season, I do have to say. Like when they go to the womb retreat, she talks to Love about her potential pregnancy and whether or not the kid might be Theo's and not Joe's. There were moments where I was like, Dottie is trying at least to be a good mom, but she is so self-involved that she doesn't really know when she's crossing the line. I like that they added this idea of her having her second act with this big vineyard that she's planning to open. As a result of that, she kind of befriends Sherry to use her for publicity reasons, which would only further distance her relationship with Love, given that Love and Sherry had this kind of strange relationship going on. And I liked it during the divorce proceedings that she ends up having the vineyard taken away from her, much like an Aversion. She starts drinking again. She picks up Henry from the babysitters without Love and Joe knowing, and ends up burning down the vineyard so that her husband doesn't get to have it. I also think that because of that whole situation happening with the vineyard is why later on when Joe gives Henry to Dante and his husband, it makes more sense why they'd be able to keep Henry. She probably would have ended up getting custody of Henry, which would have derailed everything Joe was trying to set forth with the whole murder of Love and everything. And this tied up a loose end that's been bothering me since we met Love in season 2. So Dottie has to go to rehab. That's part of like the deal that she makes with the cops for setting the vineyard on fire. Joe is the one who ends up driving her to rehab. Before they even pull away from the house, Dottie's like, I have to tell you like the truth about my daughter. I think you need to know this. And Dottie to Joe, and she's like, I don't have any proof. I don't have any way to be 100% about it, but I'm pretty sure she killed her ex-husband. And so when Dottie brought that up, I was like, okay, for sure Joe will bring this up to Love at a later time. Let's break down Love's timeline on the show. So I've already kind of like mentioned this several times, but Love is still dealing with the aftermath of 40's untimely death, especially since one of the last things that 40 said to Love, or to Love and Joe in general, was that if Love thought she'd be a great mom, she was kidding herself. She's going to be a terrible mom. And that little tiny note really plays a lot into Love's character this season. So Love's really trying to like get into the swing of things about being a new parent, and she really wants to do the best for Henry that she possibly can, but that's pretty hard when your partner is a serial killer, I imagine. Not to mention that Dottie moving closer to be near them and Henry is clearly not Love's ideal situation to be in. Yet she doesn't really do anything to stop it from happening, or at least that we know of. And of course, Dottie wants to be close to her grandson, given that she just lost one of her own children as well. I found it really interesting to kind of watch Love alongside Dottie and kind of see the dichotomy of their situation. So we catch up with Love and we know that she's going through all this stuff. And when she's at Sherry's party, she obviously has a chance to kind of talk to Natalie. And this is when Love knows like, oh, okay, this is Joe's new conquest, is this lady. Love sets up an appointment to go visit the shop that Natalie had mentioned during the Conrad party, and that's where Love ultimately murders her with an axe, which was like really intense. Like, I kind of had a feeling that we would start off the season with a murder. I just didn't know how quickly we would get to the first one. When I was rewatching this season in preparation for this video, I rewatched pieces of season 1 and 2 as well. And in both of those first 2 seasons, we don't really see the first kill happening until about 3 episodes deep, or at least till someone is captured. So I kind of liked how this season they ramped up the action, but Love murders Natalie, calls Joe and says, hey, I think we should go to therapy. Also, I kind of killed someone. So not only does she have this brief conversation with Natalie at the Conrad's party, but she also finds Joe's hideaway spot in their new house where he puts all of his little keepsake boxes, and he finds one that has a bunch of belongings to Natalie's that are reminiscent of different things that Joe collects. And that's really what tells Love like it's happening, it's starting to happen again. She decides to put an end to it by ending Natalie's life, which really pisses Joe off because basically Joe is called in to take care of the rest of it. She gets rid of the problem, and then he has to actually get rid of the problem. and that only creates more of a divide between both Love and Joe. But Natalie had given some advice to Love about how to get on Sherry's good side and how to kind of survive living in Madre Linda. I think that's how Love's kind of able to break into Sherry's clique within the season, by using those small little tactics to try to inch closer and closer into being part of Sherry's inner circle. So since she kills Natalie in the bakery, she does end up signing all the papers and opening up this new bakery in town. Her time in the shop is kind of getting people to convert and be into this pastry business. And also, since she buys the bakery, we also see that this is where the new and improved cage is put into place. We both see them hiding keys in different areas of the cage because neither of them 100% trust the other. So I believe it's in episode maybe 2 or 3 where Henry comes down with a cold, and when they take him to the hospital, we find out that Henry has contracted measles from someone unvaccinated. Enter Gil, who is another one of the neighbors of Madre Linda who doesn't believe in vaccinations. So we kind of have this like anti-vax arc of the show, which I'm kind of on the fence about. Like, to some degree, I appreciate the inclusion of this storyline because obviously it plays into what's currently going on in our actual pop culture. But I also felt like it was a little heavy-handed, and I don't know that it was 100% necessary to tell the storyline, but it does make sense as to how they can get someone into that cage. And this also serves as their kind of escape plan to pin the murder of Natalie later on Gil. Ultimately, they lock Gil in the cage, and they're trying to figure out a way to let him go by getting some kind of authority over him to keep him quiet once they let him go. But what they find out is that Gil's oldest son is an abuser of women, and he has gone to great lengths to kind of keep him under the radar and keep him out of jail. And when Gil finds out that his son has committed another crime and that his wife was actually the one that stepped in and took care of it without, unbeknownst to him, this pretty much kills him inside. So he ends up taking his own life. But they create a note for him where he confesses to killing Natalie, which again, I thought was really heavy-handed, and I didn't know how well that they could set that up to make it look like Gil could possibly have killed Natalie. It just seemed super far-fetched, but for whatever reason, the police buy it, and that sets the case aside and it's closed. So as I mentioned earlier, when I brought up the character Theo and Love meet pretty early in the season, and it's clear that Theo has quite a crush on Love, and Love is kind of indifferent towards him. I think she genuinely sees pieces of 40 within Theo's personality that kind of intrigues her enough to want to keep him somewhat close, especially given the fact that he keeps popping up at random locations. He even works briefly at the bakery from time to time for some extra spare cash. It's not until they're doing the search party for Natalie's disappearance, Theo confesses to Love how he's really feeling, how he's dealing with all of this, how his dad's basically gone off the deep end, and he's so obsessed with finding out what happened to his wife that he's really not paying any attention to Theo, who genuinely really needs his dad right now. This is a weird situation to be in. You know, he's kind of estranged from his biological mom, so he's really leaning on his dad for support, and his dad's really not around, which means that she's kind of leaning on Love, who understands this kind of mentality, given her family and their issues and the death of her twin brother. She knows what it's like to deal with death. Like, they have this affair that happens. I felt like this was the only way that we were really seeing Love sort of kind of deal with 40's demise. Their relationship, I thought it was really interesting, and I was really psyched that he ended up surviving. More on that in a minute. So another portion of Love's storyline is when she goes to this retreat, you know, we finally get some insider knowledge of what Love's really thinking. This reminded me a lot of season 1, the episode, I think it's called The Captain, but there is an episode in season 1 that is mostly done from Beck's perspective as opposed to Joe's inner thoughts. So I like that in season 3, we kind of revisited that type of storytelling by having Love's innermost thoughts going on. Subplot in this episode where Love is texting everything she feels to 40, as in it's like kind of the only way she can still kind of keep him alive. And she basically confesses to everything that's been happening and why she feels that Joe may not be her true soulmate like she once thought he was. Then we get that weird scene in the bathtub when she's at the retreat and 40 just shows up there and basically tells her, like, of course you feel the way you feel. I know you better than anyone, and I'll always be alive within you. Sweet moment, because like for those of us who were fans of 40 in season 2, it was nice to have like a little bit of a cameo appearance from his character one more time. Like, I think it's a little weird to call your twin brother your soulmate. I get it, like twins have a bond that can't really be explained unless you are a twin yourself. But I think the word choice, it's just a little bit of a confusing factor, but it makes sense as to why she has this attraction to Theo, because Theo reminds her of her brother. Again, that part I'm not going to delve into. So around this time is when she has this conversation with Sherry. Sherry had sent her this article that's from her secret blog about the swinger lifestyle, and that's when Love is kind of intrigued about maybe this is what her and Joe need to do to keep the romance alive. So Love brings up this whole swinger lifestyle to Joe, and he entertains it because then it gives him at least more freedom in his mind to continue his stalker-like behavior. But ultimately, the whole swinger thing, quite frankly, blows up in Love and Joe's face when they're finally in the midst of it with the Conrads, and Joe is hypercut with his fantasy of Marianne in his head, but you can see it also in like the way that he's interacting with Sherry, because he's like just kind of disgusted by her, but then all of a sudden is kind of in this euphoric state. Love, like that character, this is the only actor besides Penn Badgley I actually know her name, but Victoria Pedretti. Holy crap, can this lady act? Like, she is seriously so phenomenal. I'm literally gonna go out and start watching everything she's in. I fell in love with her in this season, but I really appreciate her non-verbal acting. Oh my God, I just can't get over how insanely talented this lady is. Anyway, basically she yells the safe word, getting them to end the situation, and she pulls Joe aside. This is when she tells Joe, like, I know what's going on. I know that you are infatuated with someone else. You are thinking about someone else. You are not really here with me in this moment. And it's like it was with Natalie, and that's why I had to murder her. The Conrad's obviously here, and that's how they end up getting locked in the cage. Around this time is when Love finds out from Theo that Matthew has been taking all of the surveillance footage from the cameras that happened around his death and has been following his neighbors in Madre Linda to figure out who actually murdered his wife. She basically convinces Joe to let her get closer to Theo so that they have an in to find out what Matthew actually might have on them. Love even admits to Sherry at some point while they're in the cage that she's been having a slight affair with Theo. I think this is when I started to come around on their characters, is because of how they handle the situation. Carrie is just, you know, he's just gonna try to figure out a way to actually break loose of this escape room, essentially. Whereas Sherry's trying to play the emotional card and trying to figure out how to get into Love's psyche so that maybe she can convince her to let them go. This doesn't really work to Sherry's favor. However, it does work to Love's, because basically utilize Sherry's blog to expose Matthew and thus getting him to delete all the footage that he does have. But before he deletes everything, Theo is actually able to back everything up onto a hard drive. And when Theo is later on looking at the footage to try to see if he could figure out what's going on, he finds the video of Joe getting into Natalie's car and then driving it away. And thus he believes that Joe must have killed Natalie, which from his point of view, from his perspective, that's what it looks like. So Theo goes to Love at the bakery to inform her of what he's found and to ask her if she would run away with him. But what he finds when he gets to the bakery is that Love is not currently there. I forget, she's like running an errand. And he finds the Conrads locked in the cage downstairs. So he tries to go and get the key to let them out, not really understanding exactly how they got there or what's going on. But he is stopped in his tracks by Love, who finds him trying to get the Conrads out. of course, Love is like already knows everything that's going on, and so the only thing she foresees that she can do is to get rid of Theo. So she basically gets Theo to give her back the keys. She tells him that he needs to go away, to leave town and never come back. Right as he's kind of turning to leave, she ends up hitting him over the head. He falls down the stairs, and the last thing we know of from Love's perspective is that he's probably dead. He is bleeding an exorbitant amount of blood onto the floor, then leaves Joe to clean up this mess yet again. We'll fast forward to her being at the bakery and these other new characters that I didn't bother to put into my review come into the bakery, and they're asking Love of her point of view about this Ryan Goodwin character that just passed away. This tells Love without a doubt that Joe is back to his old ways, and he is in love with his boss, Marianne. The only connection that he has to this Ryan Goodwin character. So she knows that like A, that Ryan Goodwin is Marianne's ex because she saw them at the charity event, and B, that she saw Ryan and Joe interacting briefly and it looked incredibly hostile. So she puts the pieces together and she's like, okay, now I get it. You are infatuated with your boss, and that's why you killed for her, but you will not kill for me. And in fact, you're quite resentful of me for all the murders I've done for you. Joe gets home from his hookup with Marianne. He had left Love to her own devices for quite some time, which was a detriment to his outcome later on. He gets home and Love's acting real weird. She's acting real weird. She's acting real stoic. Dinner's being cooked and everything seems normal on the outside, but we all know as an audience, like, things are about to go down. She basically tells Joe and how she found out that Joe's back up to his old ways and he's stalking again. Why can't he love her the way that he loves Marianne? And Joe confesses, I know that you've been having an affair with our neighbor's son, Theo. Clearly this isn't working and I want a divorce. Which are the worst words you could say to this lady in particular. Again, the facial acting in this scene where he confesses that he wants to get a divorce from Love, and her reaction of just subtlety and it's just silent. She can't even put words together. She keeps kind of opening and closing her mouth like she wants to say something, but she doesn't know what to say. She's just so distraught over hearing these words being brought up again to her. The moments only ended once Henry starts crying from the other room. After she gets Henry down, she comes back to the table and she has an honest discussion with Joe about James. Basically confesses like, yes, but I didn't intend to kill him. I just gave him too much of this and it ended up murdering him, but I just wanted him to stop. That's what I thought happened. They just never said it point blank. You know, it just feels good to be right. And then this is the best part is like, she's like, but don't worry, Joe. I've learned from that mistake. You have nothing to worry about. I'm not gonna do the same thing to you. And that's when I was like, oh shit. She's been growing in the garden. She decides to let it absorb through the skin. That's what she says. So the knife that Joe grabs in defense when Love is in the other room with Henry actually had this paralytic on it, and so basically his whole body starts to shut down in that moment. I was like, well, that's convenient that it didn't start to paralyze him until she said something, but whatever, we'll just go along with it. The timing of it was just like kind of perfect, the way it all times out. She has to run an errand because she has to drop off these cupcakes for that other character I mentioned earlier. What's her name? I think it's Kiki. And so he's just kind of stuck on the ground for a little while until she gets back. So because we're just talking about Love's timeline, we'll just fast forward all the things that happen there. We'll get to it when we talk about Joe. Love comes back from her errand running. She puts Henry down. Before she went on her errand, she had texted Marianne from Joe's phone and told her to come over, that it was an emergency. Basically, the plan was that she was gonna murder Marianne right in front of Joe. Marianne shows up right on time. Love asks her to come inside. She tells her right off the bat, like, I'm the one that texted you. We need to have a talk. Where Love tells Marianne that Joe's a bad guy. Marianne confesses that, you know, She realizes that she has a pattern for seeking out toxic men. And so even though she had the idea that this probably wasn't the right situation to be in, she also realizes that it's part of her own fault. And just as I believe like love was about to really launch at her, Juliet, Marianne's daughter, comes in to literally save the day. She has to use the bathroom, as kids always do in inconvenient moments. And because Love sees her daughter and she kind of looks at the magnitude of the situation and realizes, you know, killing Marianne is also going to take away this girl's parent. And so Love decides against her initial plan, and she tells Marianne to get out of town. Tells her to get as far away as possible because Joe will never stop searching for her. And that kind of ends the Marianne timeline. She returns to Joe and said, "Oh my God, I can't believe I almost took away that beautiful little girl's mother. I can see why you like her so much." I also really like that they have this like kindred moment where like Marianne is also telling her like, you should leave. Like obviously not knowing what Love is capable of, she doesn't know any better, but she tells her, you know, these things escalate so quickly, and they just have that like woman to woman moment, which I really appreciated, even though it's like completely useless at this point because Love is a murderer. Marianne leaves, and that we're just left with Love and Joe again. Love grabs a knife from the kitchen and is intending to now murder Joe with it. So I can kind of understand how she goes from like wanting to fix their marriage to just instantly being like, I'm just gonna murder him, because that's for the betterment of society as a whole and for me and for Henry. But I also thought that maybe she would want to try to sit down and force Joe into a conversation about getting a divorce as opposed to just doing it. She walks over to Joe and she pulls on his hair, and she's about ready when we see that Joe's paralyzing moment is now like officially over. Like this is what I mean by like, how does that work? Because like he was completely frozen 2 seconds ago, and now he's got all of his dexterity back. And when did the dexterity come in? He's able to dose her with basically the same thing that she had dosed him with, but because he injected it and how much he injected, this is going to be an excruciating and painful death. And that is the end of Love's timeline on the show. I am sad that we won't be seeing any more of Victoria Pedretti in the series. I assume that she may come back for like, you know, some cameo appearances or like ghost stuff, kind of like the same way Beck was in season 2. I think we could see Love returning like that as well. But for now, we know that Love is officially dead. So now that Love is dead, I think the last thing that we should do is go through Joe's timeline. So with Joe, like the biggest hang up in at least the first half of the season is his lack of bond with his child, Henry. Leading up to the birth, he had thought Henry was gonna be a girl. It's not until it's actually born that we find out it's a boy, which is quite a letdown for Joe. I assume this is because Joe really believes that a son would be more damaged like himself than it would be to have a girl. The only things I think I didn't mention that happened to Joe throughout the season is like, yes, he does start a new infatuation with Marianne, but he's trying to withhold doing his normal things. He's not going as over the top as he has previously with his conquest. But with Marianne, it's definitely different because she has this daughter and this whole custody battle thing and how awful this Ryan guy is. Later on in the season, I think Joe's ultimately trying to set up a new life for himself so that he can leave Love once and for all. This life that he thought he wanted, the white picket fence, the perfect family, that whole thing, and realizing that that isn't enough for him. Same thing with Love. I think that's something that they're both dealing with, is like realizing that the ideal that they thought they wanted wasn't actually ideal for them personally. So to hit the fast forward, because I feel like I've talked about pretty much all the major events that happened this season already, and I've talked a little bit about Joe's perspective, just like this thing where he's trying to keep Love happy so that she doesn't murder any more people. I feel like I've kind of gone over all of that, so let's just jump to the end. So he comes home, right, and they have this dinner. He tells Love that he wants a divorce, and then he gets paralyzed. During that time where he's paralyzed, Love has to run an errand, and during that time, Matthew comes over to their house looking for Theo, and he's able to kind of basically blink directions to lead Matthew in the right direction to get to Theo, and that's basically the end of his storyline. He gets Theo, and then we get a later on scene where we see that they're, you know, they've recreated their bond, they're doing okay. So then after the whole Theo thing happens, he's still lying there. He bears witness to everything that happens with Marianne and Love. When they had their party thing with the Conrads, they obviously had left some things behind because they locked them in the cage. And one of those things was this giant toolbox, essentially. So within this toolbox of miscellaneous drugs, one of those things is adrenaline. That adrenaline can be used to overpower, which he's already aware that Love has growing in the garden. Early on in the season, that Joe's taken some liking to being a gardener and taking care of his lawn and everything like that. So of course, when Love randomly starts planting these flowers in the flower bed, he starts looking into it to figure out what it is. Again, trying to point out to you that neither of these two really trust each other at the end of the day. And what we don't know, he took the adrenaline pills before anything happened at the dinner, before he grabbed the knife, and because of that, the adrenaline was then able to overpower the paralytic. Something about that timeline doesn't add up to me. It's just too a little bit like, oh, and he's not paralyzed anymore. Like, it just seems a little bit weird. And he also just so happened to have this needle handy, ready for whenever this was going to take place. Love's final words really stuck with me at the end of this, because she's like, we're perfect for each other, but we're bad for Henry. He's gonna know what you've done. She's still not taking responsibility for the fact that she murdered people too. But I thought that that was really important, and I like that final line. I like that final like close-up of them. Joe then sets forth this plan, which I think he had in the back of his mind, that as a backup plan, he had already started to put in motion some things that would allow for him to cover up the murders using Love. He creates like a fake note again that is sent out to the entire HOA and all of her neighbors and everything, confessing to killing everyone and why. He chops off 2 of his toes, which every time I had to rewatch that scene, it took everything in my power not to look away because it's like so gruesome. But I really loved that he put one of the toes into a pie, giving her the Mrs. Lovitz of Madre Linda title, which I also thought was kind of funny because all of the trailers leading into this season were heavily influenced with like baking. Oh, this is giving me big Sweeney Todd energy. The fact that they ended it with that little nod to that was super funny. A box of like trophies that she's picked up from all of her murders next to her, and then sets the entire house on fire. Joe leaves Henry with Dante and Lansing, and he leaves aside a note for them, letting them know that, like, you know, they just wanted Henry to be in a good spot, and Joe's dying wish was for him to be with Dante and Lansing, which I thought was really sweet. They even wrap it up later on in the storyline when Joe's kind of telling us what happened after he leaves, that there was a custody battle with Dottie, which I thought would be something that they would play into season 4, but upon second viewing of this season, I realized, oh, they already set up that, like, that's already been done. So Henry is for sure in their custody. He also says that he leaves a note for Henry that's just for him when he's older. And so I'm wondering if we'll be able to get a chance to see what the contents of that note would be later on in the next season. Sherry and Carrie turned their time in the cage into a monetizable book about relationship therapy and cages or something, but I thought that was like a funny way to wrap up their storyline and made sense. By the way, they found a key, and that's how they are able to escape and survive, which I would have to say that was the biggest surprise of the season. Matthew and Theo obviously grow closer, given the fact that Matthew's like there while Theo's going through recovery. I assume that Theo knows what happened to Love at this point, so I'm wondering if Theo's gonna go on the search for Joe in the next season, or if he's just going to be another character that's dropped. And then it cuts to Joe, who is in Paris now, and he's still wondering how Marianne's doing. It's the only person he hasn't been able to catch up with to see how they are, and it's kind of implied that he's going to continue searching for her until he finds her, which, knowing Joe, inevitably will happen at some point. So Joe fakes his death, and season 4, my assumption, it will take place in Paris, and we'll kind of see how long Joe can continue to get away with this. And yeah, that's pretty much You season 3. But here's a few things I have about predictions for where season 4 is gonna go. I think that there's a huge possibility that Marianne will be the center focus for Joe in the next season. I feel like their storyline isn't completely wrapped up. I felt like they really left things kind of open-ended in that regard. Even though obviously I don't believe Joe is good for Marianne. I don't think Joe's good for anyone. I am kind of interested to see if we're going to see them have any kind of relationship at a later point. Theo, I feel like he could have a bit of a vendetta against Joe, even though Joe ultimately saved him. I think that Theo still has a soft spot for love, and so I think in season 4 we could see Theo looking for Joe still. And just a side note, I didn't realize he was the kid from Halloween 2018 and Halloween Kills until after I finished the season, and we watched Halloween Kills like right after the season was over, and I was like, holy crap, that's Theo. And so I just had to bring that up real quick. Someone that I wish that we could have seen this season would be Ellie from season 2, Delilah's sister. Joe is still sending money to Ellie whenever she gets in contact with him. I know in real life that actress was filming quite a few things. She's been in quite a few like other Netflixy things, and I know that she's going to be in the new Scream movie, so maybe they couldn't get the schedules to work out well enough along with like the whole pandemic. But with Ellie, I just enjoyed her character. I enjoyed her personality. I enjoyed how like sarcastic and funny she was. So I'm kind of hoping that maybe we'll see her return in season 4. I don't know what role she would play into this. My assumption is that the information would have gotten back to her that Joe died, but maybe she knows better, so maybe she wouldn't believe that and she would then go seeking Joe out. I don't know. Due to Love's death and the fact that she is a Quinn, I can't really foresee her family just accepting the fact that she was a murderer and letting it go. I feel like there could be an investigation into her death, which if they find anything, even though like the house was burned or whatever, if they find anything, I wonder if that could lead to reopening other cases where Joe is involved, like Peach or Beck, and thus that could somehow bring Joe back to America because he has to deal with the outcome of everything he's done. But I feel like that is possibly somewhere I could see season 4 going. And lastly, this goes along with that whole thing, is like with the age of social media and face recognition software, could Joe actually disappear in Paris, or could he get spotted again? Could someone recognize him? In real life, you know, true crime is such a big pop culture center point right now. There's so many people that create that kind of content. There's so many people who are really invested in true crime. So those people potentially be the people that find Joe. I just don't know that he could totally remain unseen, and maybe someone recognizes Joe. I just don't know if I believe in the era of social media that someone could effectively disappear. You know who we didn't see this season either was Will Bettelheim. Will obviously taught Joe how to successfully escape one life and to live another, how to put together a new identity. So maybe he could successfully move to Paris and just go unseen, kind of like Will moved to wherever he moved to. I really have a strong feeling that season 4 will be the end of the show. So I think they'll be wrapping up these storylines, and I think we could see Joe being brought to justice for the murders that he has done. So my final thoughts on season 3. I felt like there was even more action in this season than there were in previous ones. I think we saw a lot more deaths than we have in previous seasons. So as a whole, I really enjoyed watching it. It kept my interest, it kept me entertained. I do think to some degree they were kind of just throwing everything they could at the wall, and just like whatever stuck, they really ran with it. So I do think that like at times it was a bit chaotic with how many storylines and how many different murders were happening all at the same time, but not by much. I don't know. I've really enjoyed this show as a whole, and I think that there are certain interesting changes that have happened to Joe over time that makes this show feel real. Rewatch season 1 just to kind of compare that against this new season. And something that I'm learning is that the relationships that Joe was getting in season 1 versus now are a lot different. They're a lot more mature. In season 1, I never thought him and Beck had anything in common, like aside from the fact that she was a writer and kind of clever and he liked to read. That was pretty much the basis of their relationship. And I think his relationships have progressed to be deeper, more meaningful relationships as the seasons have gone on, which I think is good character writing. I really, really enjoyed Love's story arc in this season. As I said before, the Conrads were a lot. They really overwhelmed me. I really loved to hate them, but I really loved them by the end of the season. So those were fun additions to this season, and I think they brought some level of comedic energy to it, which really helped to balance out all of like the murders that were going on. But we did it, guys. I talked about season 3. It took so freaking long. I hope you enjoyed this video. As always, if you enjoy listening to me banter on and on about TV shows, movies, music, and all things pop culture, do me a solid and drop a like on this video. Run over to the subscribe button, hit the bell next to it so you can be notified every time I upload. I hope you had fun. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll catch you guys next time. Bye.